Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Okay, so it's a pleasure to have Ram from the University of Edinburgh. So I was visiting Edinburgh in the summer, and we had a very, very interesting talk about learning and robotics and what role learning sort of should play in robotics with Ram. And so I invited him to share his thoughts on the subject with us. And so he accepted, and we are very happy to have him visit us.
Thank you, Pushmeet. So thanks for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first time visiting Microsoft Research, and I've been enjoying my visit so far. So I'm going to tell you a little bit today about things we do with robots. In terms of how I describe my overall research agenda, I'm somebody who's interested in robots and in trying to make intelligent systems out of them. I take a somewhat broader view of robots than is often the case when I use the word and the first impressions that you may have. So I thought I'll begin by saying a word or two about the different kinds of robots out there and what makes these kinds of problems hard. So here's a kind of characterization of some aspects of what happens when you look into an area such as robotics. There's an axis of complexity that tells you, there are, simple robots like these ones that used to scurry about in the labs 30, 40 years back, to medium grade platforms like the ones that I have many in my lab, to really state-of-the-art platforms that I would like to get my hands on. So this is made by Boston Dynamics, and it's probably the best humanoid. So this is one axis of complexity in what makes robotics problems interesting. There's yet another axis, which is what do you do with the robot? So it's interesting that there are these kinds of complexities, but why do you need it? What do we do with these things? One of the simplest things that one might want to do is to get these robots to go around an office building. So every researcher who's done computer science at some point has wondered, can this deliver coffee? Can this deliver donuts? But at the core of it, can it get around in an environment such as this, avoid obstacles, and so on. Now this has sort of become solved problem, and it's now in the homework assignment territory. There's a more complicated version of it. So here's a depiction of something from one of the DARPA Urban Challenge automated driving car visualizations. And this is, in some sense, a more complicated version of this. It's not that sophisticated a robot because in the end, a car is just a car. It's a wheeled vehicle with so many degrees of freedom. Most of the sophistication in these driving systems is in the perceptual side, right? And which means that they can deal with noise and they can deal with uncertainties in the environment. And the next level of complexity, which kind of pushes both this axis and this axis to some extent, would be like one of these robots, which is in California. It's called the PR2, which in this particular demonstration is trying to fold towels, which is something that every single common person I've spoken to says they want in their homes. So if you think about it, as roboticists, we are trying to somehow push this boundary outside. Yeah? And so we want to make these kinds of robots solve those kinds of tasks one day. But in this kind of a depiction, I'm actually leaving out one axis completely, which is going to be quite key to what I'm going to talk about today. And that axis is this third one, which refers to the idea of having these robots interact with something on the outside. Right? We already had a little bit of interaction when I said that you have to avoid obstacles, but I mean more sophisticated versions of it. So if you think in this kind of a three-dimensional space, actually this really complicated robot that's folding towels isn't really interacting all that much. And the reason it isn't is because the environment has been carefully constructed and contained so that you don't have to do a whole lot. And by this metric, you'll find that actually the much simpler car, simpler in terms of mechanics, is actually coming out on this axis because it's able to deal with things like dynamic obstacles. Things change on the road and you're able to somehow come to terms with it. And then in my own lab, we have a different category of robots, which are these robots that we call the Now, which we program to play football, among other things. And at one level, it's just a fun project that keeps people entertained. But another level, it actually pushes this axis quite far because we are always in the domain of partial observability. No robot really knows what's going on in the world. Things change. and we are always having to come to terms with these kinds of issues. So if you think about what makes robotics hard, I would argue, I mean, all of these axes are important, but for the purposes of how I'm going to speak today, I'm going to be focusing on what it will take to actually push along this axis, how to come outside so that we can genuinely interact. And one of the reasons we might want to do this is because one of these days, well, not one of these days, we already have a number of autonomous systems out there that I interact with on a daily basis. So the GPS system tells me where to go, and people have wearable sensors that are giving them data. And at this point in time, a lot of these things are either just data collection devices or data output devices. I would like to ask, what will it take to actually close the loop and put the person and make decisions in the presence of the person, which is the kind of motivation behind all of these kinds of things. Right? Now, let me kind of lay the scene a little bit. So there are, what I'm arguing is that there's a kind of spectrum of interactions, and then there's a spectrum of learning problems. So the first one I'm going to tell you about today is what happens if you have a robot that's performing some kind of a task, let's say a motion task, and then you have parametric variations, such as the weight changed or so on. Right? And so most of the time, these things amount to, in one form or the other, learning vector fields or manifold structures. Right? And rather than tell you this thing in the abstract, I thought I'll show you a video. And this is a video of an autonomous agent that I'd love to be able to replicate. And the context of this video is that this is the first time this person has ever attempted the task that I'm going to show you. And you're going to see a few replications of this task. So that's the very first time she's tried to climb that ottoman. She had just learned to walk maybe a couple of weeks before this video was shot. And this is her first time trying, not too comfortable, and she gives up. This is maybe trial 5 or trial 6. Much better. And this is probably, I don't remember how many, but this was under 20 trials, each trial lasting a few seconds each. And there's your agent who's managed to figure this out. So she had a basic behavior, which was how to stand up on flat ground, and then she managed to adapt it. And simply put, we don't have anything in robotics that can replicate that level of adaptation. Right? And this is something that we aspire to, and I'll say a little bit about how we might actually reach things like this. And this is step 1, which is how do you actually deal with mechanics. Step 2 is a slightly different kind of interaction. In step 2, what we are interested in is a scenario such as the toy problem that I've made up there, in which you have a robot that's been tasked with something such as babysit this child. Yeah, so just watch this child and do some basic surveillance. And the task is also defined by the fact that you want to keep this child away from unsavory characters. And you have to perform this task without actually having a priori information about this monster, right? And you have to find a way in which you can do something like this. This brings you into the territory of essentially inverse planning, which is what is that person doing, plan recognition, and issues like this. And then if you take this to its kind of logical next step, you'll find that you're asking a number of different questions that we normally don't associate with robotics at all. But then increasingly, this is the kind of thing that we want to put into systems. So with this preamble, I'm going to give you my story in 3 parts, pretty much those 3 parts that I put up on the board. And so the first part, we're going to ask the question, how is it that the person in the video was my daughter, and that was the first time she had tried this. How is it that she could figure out how to adapt her behavior? And a key construct in how in robotics we've been trying to replicate this idea is to use the notion that animals are so good at it because they can use essentially the natural dynamics of the system to perform part of the computation. So when I say perform part of the computation, here are kind of 2 examples of how biologists conceive of animals computing. One example is that if you have a really high dimensional system, such as the number of degrees of freedom defined by our muscles and so on, it is very, very rare that an animal actually excites all of the axes defined by this high dimensionality. More often than not, the animals are exploiting some kind of conservation principle, energy minimization, and so on and so forth, so that what they're actually controlling is a much lower dimensional system, and they're just cleverly simultaneously controlling the low dimensional system and getting it done with the high dimensional system, so that they can only deploy the full variability when required, right? And so this happens at the level of controlling muscles. This happens at the level of how you actually interact with the ground, so that every time you hit a wall, you push off. You don't really model the wall, and then you just come up with some way in which you exploit it. So the question that we were asking was, all of these principles have been known to biologists for a while. And it's been very clear that even though these problems seem completely intractable from a pure computer science planning point of view, they're being solved by nature repeatedly. The question was, can you actually merge the two worldviews? Can you actually exploit the idea of natural dynamics and still have the ability to learn, plan, and do things actively? So we started looking at this with a much simpler problem than walking, but I'll bring it back to walking shortly. The simpler problem is something that you might have seen before if you've encountered any control theory course, or if you've looked at anything to do with reinforcement learning for control. And the problem is this, that you have a pole that's sitting on top of a cart, and you want to somehow stabilize the pole. So the kind of common picture we use is you want to balance a broom on your hand. You have no actuation on your hands, you're not holding it, you just want to balance it. And there are a number of different strategies that one could come up with. But it turns out that this system is incredibly simple in terms of what is the optimal strategy. Yeah, there's a very nice and elegant qualitative strategy that solves this problem. And that solves the problem for an entire family of these systems in terms of weight variation and so on. And you can understand that strategy as follows. Think about the dynamics of a pendulum. Yeah? And what I'm going to show you is a video in which you're going to see two simultaneous visualizations. One of these is the pendulum that's moving around in physical space. And what's going to be plotted here is the phase space, which is the angle and the first derivative of the angle. And if you look at how this system evolves, you'll find that any motion that can be realized in physical space corresponds to trajectories that are being drawn out in phase space. And more importantly, that there are only really two families of trajectories in phase space. And there's only one parameter that's controlling this entire family, which is the amount of energy that you're putting into the system. So if you give very little energy to the system, you'll always find yourself in this small oscillation region going around in small circles. If you give a lot of energy, you'll find yourself in this red family, and this corresponds to going round and round. And then there's exactly one separating trajectory between these two families. So as a person who's trying to write down a model, what happens if you make a mistake? Supposing you get the mass wrong, supposing you get the friction wrong. So fundamentally, this picture is never going to change. This is the qualitative structure of the problem. And equally, if you make small mistakes, the worst you can do is to get yourself wrong in trajectories. You don't get yourself wrong fundamentally in the family. Which means you can come up with a very elegant solution to balancing pendulums, which corresponds to this. You want to get from that point, which corresponds to having the pendulum just hanging down, to that point, right? And the second point corresponds to here. So this is angles, this is the zero angle, this is pi. And then you want to go from being at rest below to being at rest here, right? And then any perturbations that me, the experimenter, does to this system would be to push you in different places in this phase space. So what would the control strategy be in this kind of a system? So it turns out that the control strategy is simply, no matter where you are in this region, pump in energy. And you can pump it in with any function you like. Just make sure that it's monotonically increasing energy, which means that you're going to get towards one of these orbits. And if you find yourself here, decrease energy and you're going to get towards here. And so with a careful combination of these two things, you have no choice but to end up with a solution. So actually, even with significant amounts of parametric uncertainty, you can come up with a strategy that can actually push you back to the right region that you're interested in, if you understand the qualitative nature of the solution, right? And when I say, pump in energy and move this, what does that actually mean? You can state this in terms of differential equations by saying the underlying system that you're interested in is some kind of a second order differential equation. And pump in or take out energy corresponds to the sign of what's in front of that f function. So if you have a certain sign, then it's going to have a certain behavior, which means that you're going to be asymptotically stable. If you have the opposite sign, you're going to explode. So the solution to the pendulum problem is explode when you're here, somehow get near here, then switch to stabilizing. And as long as you do these two things, it's going to work. And you can get a lot of things wrong and it's still going to work.
So the rate at which you actually give the energy, so that never appeared, right? If that is bounded, if you are only allowed to give a pulse every second, or every sort of half a second, then basically the amount of energy that you should give then changes, right?
Yeah. So it would change the quantitative nature of how you get there, but it doesn't change the qualitative idea that you would get there. So here's the final outcome of doing all of this.
Sorry, just what did that square bracket notation mean?
Let me go back to that. Why don't I play the video and then I'll go back to it. Yeah. So here's the system starting from the beginning. And there's going to be a quick pump in of energy and then catching. And that's essentially the answer. And then the rest of it is the real interesting part of the problem, which is, can you actually play with the system? And you can keep perturbing it, and the system knows that all it has to do is to control the rate of energy. Right? So now let me go back and... Yeah, so this notation says that this function has the same sign as that variable. So any function f that satisfies the idea that this and this have the same sign would be sufficient for this lemma to hold.
For all x, or at 0?
No, so f of x dot has the same sign as x dot, g of x has the same sign as x.
Everywhere?
Yes. And so if you could have that within this differential equation, then all functions that can satisfy that will have this qualitative property. Right? And I can talk you through the details of this after we finish, if you like. So why are we studying pendulums? I mean, so this is a start towards the more interesting question, which was bipedal walking, right? And so in bipedal walking, what we were interested in was, is it possible for you to come up with a strategy so that as you change things, such as I want you to step right here, I can come up with a solution to the problem that is always dynamically realizable, and then that also satisfies this idea of natural dynamics. And we had to solve this under the constraint that we don't actually have a model of the system to begin with. We are in the learning paradigm, and so we want to somehow merge these two things. Okay? And it turns out that the reason we were studying pendulums is because actually our body is like a pendulum. If you think about what you do when you walk, you have this big mass that's sitting up there, which you can just think of as a ball, and then that mass is actually just being controlled by us doing this. So you push off and then you catch, you push off and you catch. And biologists know this as what we call the compass gate walking model. It's an idealized abstraction. Nobody says that you actually are a pendulum at all times. But it's an abstraction that describes the energetics and the qualitative structure of the task. Right? And I've already told you that there is all this nice structure in the pendulum phase space, which means that you can parameterize all walking tasks in some abstract space in terms of a combination of the way in which you swing your leg and then the way in which you push off. Right? So any walking trajectory in an abstract description is going to be some pair of these trajectories. So let me show you a visualization that tells you in what sense it's a pair. So what you'll see here is this abstract pendulum-like walking model, and you'll see me give it an arbitrary sequence of footsteps that change in height, width, and so on. And here you will see the kind of trajectories that are required to realize that footstep. So what we have is a qualitative parameterization of what it means to walk with a continuously changing goal, right? And it's still qualitative because that's not the real robot. That's just my abstract model of the robot in terms of the pendular dynamic system. But it's telling you what the essential task ought to be. How much energy do you need to pump in, which goes back to your question about the rate at which we do these things. Now, if you know this, then you can get into the territory of machine learning, where the paradigm in which we are operating is to say that we have some kind of an analytical understanding of the qualitative structure, and then we have the capacity to learn about the dynamics of the system from data. Yeah, so we can do random babbling and various kinds of data acquisition, which gives us some idea of what the dynamical system ought to be, and then we use that to enforce this plan. Right? So this gives us the best of both worlds in terms of how we're going to do it. And the way we do it is to essentially utilize the idea that the dynamical equivalence between the qualitative model and the full dynamics is in the sense that there's some consistency between the two manifolds. Right? There's a high dimensional state space, and then all trajectories are some sub-manifold in that space. There's a low dimensional model that's describing what the vector field ought to look like. Make sure that these two things are consistent, and you can write this down as essentially an optimization problem. If you can make sure that those two things are consistent, then you obtain a submanifold in the full configuration space that corresponds to all the geodesic trajectories that are walking. Right? And so then you can use this to do active planning. So here are 3 examples of walking with respect to variable footstep. And the most interesting thing is not just that we can do this, but we can do this at an energy cost that is not that much more than passive dynamic walkers, which are kind of like the holy grail of getting things for free. And so this was a fairly interesting result. This is nowhere near as close to my daughter's video, but it's along the way. And philosophically, this is the kind of general paradigm that we'll be using everywhere. Okay. Then after that work was done, we started asking, okay, but this is delicate. We need to have the qualitative model. Is there anything more to this manifold idea if you don't have a good qualitative model? So to explore that, we started looking at it more directly. We started getting data based on some consistent behavior, such as somebody demonstrating to you that these are all reaching movements or these are all walking movements. And we said, okay, we're going to directly do manifold learning on that data without the benefit of the qualitative model now. And this is something that in machine learning we know how to do with a number of different algorithms. And at the core of it, what we are doing is just making sure that the tangent spaces of the manifolds align up locally with what the data is telling you. Right?
So
now,
can you just remind me again, what are X and Y?
So what we are trying to say here is, let me go back to this data. So there's a high dimensional dynamics, which is my full configuration space, which is every joint in my body. And then there's a low dimensional configuration space, which is what the submanifold coordinates are telling you.
Does the high dimensional space have velocities in it, or just positions?
So in the data-driven only case, we only have positions. We don't have velocities.
So X is joint angles of the body.
No. So the way we have it, if I remember my notation correctly, X's are the joint spaces, are the joint angles of your body, and then Y are the reparametrization in terms of the manifolds. Right? And so the key point that I want to leave you with is the fact that if you talk about all of your dynamics being trajectories on top of this manifold, which is something that we do all the time in machine learning, there's one thing that you're still leaving out, which is what happens when I pull you away from it. So you're actually controlling a dynamical system, right? So I can actually push you away from it. And so what we are interested in is not just what happens here, but what does the behavior look like outside. Okay? And this is something that we looked at, and we found out that even if you don't have the privilege of the qualitative model, it's actually beneficial for you to have this kind of a manifold notion as an encoding of skill. Okay? So let me show you what this manifold looks like and what it gives you for a robot arm. So here I'm going to show you a couple of visualizations that are associated with a 3-link arm. Right? So there are 3 jointed arms. And what you see here is the submanifold, and then the kind of projection onto it from a number of different random perturbations away from it. Right? So that projection essentially gives you a distance throughout the configuration space. And it's telling you that if you're in this configuration, you're this far away from your skill. And so you have an error metric with which you can get back onto your manifold. And in a minute, you're going to see this realized on a robot. So this is a simulation of a robot that we have in the lab. Begins to do a particular task that corresponds to being on top of a manifold. We push it, and then it goes back to the manifold by using this error function, which is distance from the manifold. And then it continues along on one of the geodesic trajectories on it. So even in the absence of the qualitative construction, it's useful to have this kind of a manifold model. But in the presence of it, you get that much more benefit in how well you can learn it and what you can do with it. Okay. So that's one level of interaction. And at this level, what I've been interested in is trying to counteract changes in the dynamics of the environment, and then trying to come up with ways in which you can counteract the perturbations with a skill encoding that's a qualitative one. Yeah. The next question we started asking is, okay, I mean, this is all nice, but we delicately depended upon dynamical systems. Yeah. And is there more to it than that? You know, this idea of trying to say that there's a skill encoding and you're trying to switch between skill encodings, does it actually lift up beyond that? So we've started looking at it in the context of decision problems that have to do with motion planning. And the kind of thing I want you to keep in mind is this picture that I drew earlier, in which the robot has a task such as track a process and then keep it away from a process and so on. And the key idea here is that the number of different tasks you could be playing is parameterized by the number of different plans this person could be using, right? And if I said that I want you to solve this kind of a non-stationary MDP process by itself, we know that this is next to intractable, yeah? And this is incredibly difficult. So what we've been asking is to take a slightly different viewpoint, which is, can we think about some kind of prior knowledge, where the prior knowledge here might be some idea of a number of different types that you can assign to this agent, and then say that based on these kind of qualitative understanding of the types, can I quickly lock in on one of these and then come up with a policy that can utilize something about this. So this is what in a certain aspect of machine learning we call the policy reuse problem, or otherwise you can think about it as a version of transfer learning in which you want to get from one task to the other. So what we're interested in is, I don't have a disambiguating signal explicitly, and I want to use my performance in the task to disambiguate which world do I believe I'm playing in. And I might say that I have a number of different prior policies that I can use. So if I see people with red shirts, then I act in a certain way. If I see people who look threatening for some reason, I act in a certain way. So I have a number of different policies that I can just write down. These could be learned from data, these could be handcrafted, whatever. And what I'm really asking is, does my solution space naturally partition itself so that I can use one of these by quickly identifying what's going on? And my basis for identification is going to be, am I performing well or not, right? And so what would such a policy reuse algorithm look like? The core of such an algorithm actually depends on the following observation, which is that my world is some set of models. Yeah, depending on what you assign to this other adversarial character, you could be in one of these different models. I could adopt one of some number of policies. If I adopt a policy in some model, then I'm going to get a certain kind of performance. So it may be that this policy performs well under this world, but performs badly here, and so on, right? So what this tells you is that over a space of all possible models, you have some profile of performance by which you can characterize any given policy. Right? And then you can think about there being general policies that are generically good for lots of different worlds, but don't necessarily give you very high reward, versus very specific kind of models which are highly peaked, but then they could also give you really bad performance everywhere else. So we can think about a library of policies that we've constructed like this, and we could ask, given any particular world that you've thrown me in, is it possible for me to find out which world it is in? And is it possible for me to use this kind of a notion of there being a characterization of the world in terms of performance to do this identification? And so we modeled this kind of a problem as essentially a problem in which every world is described by a particular instantiation of a Markov decision process. So I'm going to describe a Markov decision process in terms of states, actions, transition functions, rewards, and a discount factor. And I'm going to parameterize my worlds in terms of the different types that I could have, right? And what we are asking is, I'm going to throw you into one of these. I'm not going to tell you which one it is. You have to quickly figure out which one it might be. So the way we can approach a problem like this is to turn this into essentially a Bayesian choice problem, right? So we could say that in the absence of knowing anything about the world, I maintain a belief about which world I'm in. In the beginning, it might just be a uniform distribution. Maybe over time, you have some reason to change these beliefs. If you have a belief, then it's possible for you to define your optimal response to this world in terms of some notion of Bayesian averaging, right? And then you can think about it as essentially an integral over all possible models. This is conceptually nice, but it's definitely not what you want to do in most realistic problems, because these integrals can be quite hard to evaluate in general, right? So what we're interested in is how would you actually approximate this, and how would you approximate this so that you can play fast with a library. And here's one approach you could take, and we divide this approach into an offline learning phase and an online learning phase. So what we think of is that you're going to initially, in your offline learning phase, send your agent to school. So your agent is going to go off and try to play in a number of different test worlds that you've given it. And each of these worlds is going to be a particular type of Markov decision process for which it's going to come up with an optimal policy. The key construct that you have to keep in this algorithm is some idea of performance between worlds and policies. Right? So this distribution that I showed you earlier, you try to maintain it to say that if I had played this policy in this kind of a world, I would have got this kind of a performance. So that when I put you in the test world and I say quickly figure out what's going on, what you do is you make an inference with respect to these distributions and say, I've played 5 times, I haven't got any reward, this can't possibly be the right world for my policy. Right? So you're in statistical terms trying to make this thing precise by saying that you're doing a belief update with respect to this distribution that's telling you if I was in that type and if I played that policy, how much performance should I expect. Right? And so based on realized performance, you can do a belief update and come up with which world do I believe I'm playing in. So this is a basis for policy reuse. So you can say that even though I don't have an explicit signal from the outside, if I have a good enough policy library incorporating the relevant qualitative types of the process, then it's possible for me to relatively quickly identify which one it is based on realized performance. Okay? And we wouldn't want to implement it naively like this, because this thing is crucially dependent upon what kind of worlds I gave you at test time, right? At training time. So if I just gave you one kind of world and then I go and test you on some other world, you're not going to do well at all. So it's important for me to somehow rebalance all of this so that I give more weight to things that are representative of different parts of the space. So we can actually implement the choice in terms of an expected value with respect to my belief, but also an additional weighting function that says if I got a lot of training in some part of my type space, then I weight it less. And if there are rare instances that I only occasionally see, then I assign more weight to that aspect of my belief. Right? So I can use my weight function on top of this to essentially unbias this process and then try to get at what is the essential qualitative structure of this task. And we played this on a number of different domains. So what I show you here is an example of a performance of this algorithm in a Pac-Man domain. So it's a popular video game if you've played it at some point. So what we have is a number of different tasks that are defined by the behavior of the ghost agents. Yeah? So as we change the ghost agents, we want to see how quickly you catch on to which instance of Pac-Man I've given you. So it turns out that compared to benchmarks such as just naive reinforcement learning, or a benchmark in which we use a bandit algorithm to try to make the same online choice, we are actually much faster in how we make a choice if we are put back in a world that is very close to the ones that we trained in. If we are in a world that's slightly different from the world that we have trained in, but still somehow covered by our space of experience, then we are still comparable, but actually asymptotically the other learning agents can get better because we are not yet learning in this setup. The more worrying case is what happens if we are put in a world that we've never seen at all. Yeah? And this corresponds to being put somewhere there. Yeah? So we've never seen this world, what are we supposed to do? So this is where we take the view that the essential concept of what's going on in our algorithm is that we have a number of different types that we are using to identify. So why don't we grow the library as we go along in life? Yeah, so we can, every time we find ourselves in a situation like this, we want to use the performance to try to grow our library and get better at what's going on. So what we do is we do our best for policy reuse in terms of this original distribution that we had already learned on the number of different types that we have. And if we find that our performance is going to be below a threshold by using the best policy we can from our model, then we say, okay, we are going to initiate a learning type, And so we're going to learn from scratch with Q-learning on this particular world, and we're going to go put that back into our library. So it would be like saying, I have tried all the different types in that space, but there's this big hole that I have never tried, and so my performance there is not good, so I'm going to add a new type there. Right? And it turns out that even if we start from scratch, this thing converges to a stable number of types that approximately corresponds to the real number of types in the world. And this kind of a notion of trying to maintain a policy library and then to incrementally grow this policy library is a reasonable kind of strategy for these kinds of interaction problems that we are interested in.
So in terms of the literature on Markov decision processes, were there latent variables which were there latent variable models together with MTPs? So this is the latent variable, right? You are trying to find out the type is the latent variable of the MTP, which is associated to the MTP, right? Yeah. So have people looked at latent variable MTPs before?
People have looked at, they don't call it latent variable MDPs. So what one typically looks at is what we call a robust MDP. And in a robust MDP, what you say is that you have a family of these MDPs and you want to come up with a policy that's simultaneously good for all of these things. Yeah? And the other alternative that people take is to say that I have an MDP that's non-stationary and that keeps drifting, and I want to quickly identify which one it is. So the one that we are comparing against, which is like this PRQ one, is a policy reuse algorithm that's based on a banded style choice of that latent variable. So it's not a latent variable in the sense of a Bayesian choice, but it's more of an online learning mixture of experts kind of approach. And so compared to that, we actually do much better. But this question of can you actually maintain a full, an actual latent variable about it, there isn't that much that's been done. And so that's somewhere that we'd like to go with this kind of work. And so one more test that we'd like to do with these kinds of algorithms that's kind of important for sanity is what happens if we get trained on a number of different types that is non-uniform in the sense that there's an entire region of space that you never saw. Yeah? And then we test you on the whole space. Then how do you do? So we did this test to see how well we do, and we find out the way we measure performance in this test is that we take what is the best possible performance that we could have got with the correct type, and then what is the actual performance that we got. And then we take this as a measure of regret. And perfect performance in a world like this would have been a curve that says, I go straight up there, and then I don't make any mistakes. I always use the best policy. And you find that when we test on something like this, if we just do the base case scenario that I showed in one of my earlier slides, then you get pretty close already, and by the time you do this idea of clustering and skeletonization, you begin to get quite close.
So how do you compute the regret? Because the max is over an infinite family, right? Because there are infinite possible types.
Yeah, so in this case, we are measuring it with respect to all the possible types that you could have had if you had uniform sampling.
I see.
Yeah. Okay. And yeah, it's not analytically computed. It's computed by sampling. Yeah. But nonetheless, on a kind of two parameter problem like this, it isn't that different. As we get to higher dimensions, this is going to be a big issue that we'll have to look at. Yeah. So that whole thread is about this idea of asking, how do you make an online choice? So if you remember when I started with the first one, which was that I want to talk about a dynamical system, and I want to talk about controlling the dynamical system in terms of a number of different qualitative families, so pump, spin, and so on, and I want to make this choice. So the second thread was, okay, how do you actually make this online choice in a more general decision problem where the types could be whatever you want? Yeah. And the kind of next logical step in this kind of reasoning would be to ask what happens if you actually have strategic interaction. Yeah, this is something that I'm quite keen on, because if you think about the problem I told you of the robot trying to watch this child and not get into trouble with that, fundamentally it's a strategic problem because the robot has to also consider what that other person might actually be thinking. Yeah, and then I'm not a good enough artist, but you could take this to as long as you want. And there are interesting points such as I At one level, I don't even know if this other person is playing a game. Maybe it's a very, very simple agent and he just does completely reactive things. Or maybe it's a very sophisticated and strategic agent and he's going to think at an arbitrary level of recursion. Yeah? So what would qualitative behavior here look like? And what would a type look like in this? So in fact, the word type that I'm using was inspired by the way in which game theorists look at problems like this. And in a Bayesian game, you talk about the idea of there being types of players and keeping distributions over them. So qualitative types here would be all the possible strategies that one could use if they believed that they were playing a certain kind of problem. So like there's a famous problem called the prisoner's dilemma, which has to do with a certain way in which you reason about the other player cooperating or defecting. And types there might be things such as in an iterated game, if you do bad things to me, what do I do to you? So if I were the kind of person who adopts that strategy, then I'm a certain kind of qualitative player. And as long as my belief says, oh, you're that kind of a player, I can come up with a response that's good enough to this. Yeah.
So in the game theory literature, another notion of type is the number of levels of reasoning somebody sort of thinks about, right?
Yeah.
So level 2 reasoning type, or level 3 or level 4 and so on.
Yeah. So in what I'm going to say in the next few slides, I'm going to mean type as in strategy. I'm not yet talking about variation in recursion. But I think we could make a version of this that would fit that as well. Yeah. So to continue with this kind of theme that I'm building up, I want to ask, how would you model this kind of a problem in terms of policy reuse, which is that I have a set of qualitative models and I want to somehow use it. So it turns out that if you want to describe interaction, the essential idea of decision making as a Markov decision process is okay, except you need an n-player version of it because there are n players, right? And the n-player version of such a thing is typically called a stochastic game. So it looks the same in that you still have a state space and an action space, and you now have an action space for every player that you have. And in addition to that, you have a utility for every player. So the same outcome in the world might mean more to me than it means to you, and so on. And then you have the standard constructions in an MDP, such as there's a transition dynamics that says if both of us do this, we go from one place to the other, and so on. And there are two additional things which have to do with the Bayesian nature of thinking about a game like this, which is that there's some underlying notion of a distribution of types. So it might be that the whole world just consists of reactive players who don't do anything, and that would be a certain assignment of types to every player. Or it might be that in some delicate way, some people are strategic, some people are not, and so on, and that will be a different assignment of types, right? So you define the game in terms of an underlying n-player MDP, and then these distributions of types, and then some prior distribution over what those types are. And this problem that I'm talking about of throwing an agent into a world and somehow figuring out if they can do something interesting in that world quickly, what does it actually mean in game theoretic terms? What does it mean in a formal sense to say that in an ad hoc interaction you're doing well? So there are two essential ideas, and you don't need to pay too much attention to the equation if you don't like. The essential idea is that you want to be flexible and you want to be efficient. Flexibility means that no matter what type you give me in this realization of the game, it's possible for me to bring the game to a conclusion. Yeah? It's possible for me to find a path that gets me to the right place for all possible assignments of types and all possible assignments of priors. And if I can make this probability 1, then I'm an incredibly flexible agent. Yeah, and then as this goes down, I'm that much less flexible. And efficiency is just taking this idea and then weighting all the utilities I can get with respect to all the possible realizations of these paths. So when I say that I want to have an agent that is very good at interacting in an ad hoc sense in a game theoretic setting like this, what I mean is that I'm going to be talking about a whole class of stochastic Bayesian games in which you can assign different priors and different types to these agents. And I want to be able to optimize my flexibility and efficiency in this kind of a game, subject to the constraint that I don't know what the actual realized types are. Right? And this is what in that literature would be called an incomplete information game. It's incomplete in the sense that I don't actually know which game got realized. I have some kind of a stochastic understanding in terms of what kind of players there might be in the world, and I have some qualitative understanding of, these are the kinds of players that you could have, but I don't know which game actually got realized. So this idea of trying to interact in an ad hoc sense corresponds to somehow learning to play this game well. Yeah? When game theorists came up with these kinds of ideas, they were interested in analyzing what could happen in such a game. So I'm taking the more computer science point of view, which is I want to build an agent that can do this well. Yeah, and I'm going to use all of this construction as a basis on which to plant my learning algorithm so that I can somehow reason about these distributions and then try to learn to play these games well.
So this is not specific to multiplayer games, right? Because you can consider, you can just consider a two-player game where the other player is the environment.
Yeah.
So we were talking about the DARPA challenge,
Yeah.
and you were mentioning that there were two issues there, right? Again, in the two metrics, that with some sort of user feedback,
Yeah.
the car is able to, or the robot is able to perform those tasks,
Yeah.
right? And you want to minimize that.
Yeah, that would be fine. So the only reason to think about this as a game might be to say that is there any recursion of belief? Yeah. So if you say that the other side is actually just nature, a game versus nature, then this problem actually becomes somewhat easier because you don't have to worry about recursion of belief at all, and then the whole thing might actually collapse down to be something much simpler. Yeah. So it turns out that there's a very elegant solution already in game theory for reasoning about these kinds of games, these kinds of incomplete information games. And the solution amounts to essentially being Bayesian and saying that my world consists of agents. Agents have types. There's some kind of a prior distribution over these types, and that prior distribution is common knowledge to every player. Yeah. So if all of this is true, then you can forget about this incompleteness, think in terms of Bayesian averaging, and turn it into what we call an imperfect or just a noisy game. So it's just noisy in the sense that I don't know what got realized. I'm going to average with respect to all of those types. Right? If you do that, you can define a notion of optimum, which is just a probabilistically averaged view of all the possible utilities you can get. So you can get a number of different utilities by playing a number of different policies, and then you can weight it by all the possible probabilities that define which types these players might have. What is difficult about an ad hoc interaction problem is that you don't know this, right? But you can perhaps keep proxies for this, such as you can say that I'm going to come up with some kind of a belief update process based on observed histories, and I'm going to do my best estimate of what that probability could have been, right? And if you could do this, it's actually known that it's possible to learn to play these kinds of games. So there are a number of different nice results that say that even with a kind of weak posterior update like this, if you have the right kind of alignment between posteriors and priors, these games can actually come to a nice equilibrium, which means that at that point, all of us are getting the best possible utility in a local sense, and you can ignore the notion of strategic uncertainty and just play as though that's a good place to be. The only problem is that this equilibrium notion is kind of delicate for a number of different reasons. The most important one is the last one, which is what you were raising, which is that maybe the players have different levels of strategic look ahead, maybe the players have different kinds of types, maybe there is no player at all, maybe it's just nature and so on. Which means that you can't always make the kinds of assumptions that are made in these kinds of theorems. And then there are other issues such as what happens if there are multiple equilibria and so on and so forth. And pretty much if you think about it, all of these things amount to the fact that the difficulties come from being somewhat myopic or somewhat restricted in how you do your belief updates. So if you could merge two things, if you could borrow this idea of having some kind of a Bayesian notion of types, and then if you could borrow a different idea from something like reinforcement learning and say that I can do forward planning, then you could possibly come up with a kind of intermediate solution that would learn to play these games well. And that's what we came up with, and we called it Hasani Bellman in honor of Hasani is the person who came up with the notion of types, and Bellman is Bellman from reinforcement learning, where what we did is we took the idea of a Nash equilibrium, and then we swapped out the notion of utilities by a forward planning in terms of the Bellman equation. And what we are doing is we are taking the Bellman equation for a number of different possible worlds, and we are averaging it with respect to a belief that we are keeping over the types of the possible world. Right? So this, if this had been utilities and that had been the policies, would have been a Bayesian Nash equilibrium. And we're just modifying it to take into account this reinforcement learning style notion of utility. And by doing this much, we don't do too much violence to the model. We can still say that it has some nice properties. If we play this algorithm against itself, it does okay. It reaches Nash equilibrium. And then if you're in a world in which others are what we call deterministic learners, and by this I simply mean that you will consistently learn in the same way in different places. You can use whatever algorithm you like, but you're not randomizing over that algorithm. Yeah? So in a world like that, you still actually maximize your efficiency, and you do this without a priori knowing which game you're playing and what kind of players are on the other side. So this last one would cover the DARPA Grand Challenge case, in which you're saying that I'm put in some world, that world behaves in some sensible way, and if I play this algorithm, then it's going to learn to do this better. So I'll skip this and get to experiments. So we did this in two major styles of experiments. So the first experiment we did was essentially a certain kind of logistics problem. And by logistics, I mean we think about a problem in which you want to go off and collect some food, and there are a number of different agents. And some of these foods can only be lifted if you have enough agents that go along with you, right? So the coordination comes from the fact that you don't know how the other players are going to behave, but if you coordinate with them, you could get high value foods and bring it back. And you can think about this as a proxy for various other processes, such as being in a factory and being in a number of different logistics domains. And in the experiments that we did with this, we played off against three benchmarks that are fairly popular in the multi-agent learning literature, that are all variants of what used to be called fictitious play. Yeah, so joint action learners are essentially learning agents that keep statistics over how different players behave and then play with respect to that. And then Wolf PHC is a much more advanced version of this with variable learning rates and so on. And just about every variant of our algorithm did better than those in terms of efficiency, simply because we have a much better ability to look ahead, and we're able to join this look ahead with the way in which we are doing belief updates. But we were still not as good as humans. So we actually got people to play the exact same game in a video game style setup in which some of these players were going to be people. So there are still things that you can do better, and this is something that we'd like to understand. In order to understand it, we actually did a much more elaborate experiment. So here we simplified the game itself, but then we did it more elaborately in the sense that we played it against a vast cohort of real people. So recently we had an exhibit at the Royal Society exhibition where we got people to play two games. One is the rock, paper, scissors game that everybody knows from childhood. Another is Prisoner's Dilemma, which is a very popular strategic kind of game. And we played our algorithm against 400 plus participants, and they were split between the games like that. And then it included a very vast array of age groups. So we had some people who were children for whom this game looked really odd, and some people who really knew this game from before. And so we really had this variation of types. Some people knew what the optimal strategy was. They came in knowing tit for tat. And some people had no clue, and they were trying to learn on the spot. And here are the results that we got. And I'm plotting the results for two games, Prisoner's Dilemma and Rock, Paper, Scissors. And I'm comparing our algorithm versus the best other benchmark. Now, the interesting thing is that we don't actually do that much better than many other multi-agent learning algorithms in terms of payoff. Where we do better is in terms of whether we were able to find places where we could lead people into interesting modes. So was it possible for us to actually maximize the welfare by understanding, oh, you're this kind of a player, so if I did this, maybe you will go here. And so our ability to look ahead with respect to these qualitative types gave us a significant boost in how we could maximize welfare, and then how we could actually exploit our knowledge of types to go from just statistically doing well to actually influencing the game in a meaningful way. Yeah. And to us, this was very exciting. And then we went and showed this to some economists who think about behavioral games and so on. And then that brought up a whole variety of subtle questions, such as what do people do when they know that you're playing against a computer versus people, and so on and so forth. So there's still a lot that we'd like to do in this kind of a space, but I present this result more along the lines of saying that this notion of having some kind of a qualitative structure of the problem, both at the level of types and so on, but also at the level of this is a game like this, and then plugging in machine learning algorithms into that is a sort of interesting paradigm. At this point, how much time?
I think
Okay, so then let me conclude by actually jumping straight to another experiment that we did, where I'm not going to tell you the setup of the experiment, but I'm just going to call upon a video which is going to tell you what happens. So we took all of these algorithms that I've been talking about, and implemented it on a robot. And what you see here is the result of this implementation in our lab, in which in a minute, once it gets through all of this, what you're going to see is a penalty shootout between two robots. Yeah? So we are in a setup in which we have these two robots that I said were playing football. One of the robots is controlled by a person through a joystick, and the other robot is entirely autonomous. And you're going to see a number of different variations on this theme. Yeah? So the first variation is we have a human-controlled striker, this guy, versus just a heuristic goalkeeper, which is how we are getting data on what people actually seem to be doing. And the key thing to note in a problem like penalty shootout is, is that the most important thing you have to do is to somehow convince the other person to go to the other side implicitly, so that you can create all of this space and try to shoot. So what we did is we looked at how people play this game. We acquired a lot of data from people playing this to try to acquire the kind of natural types for trying to do this kind of interaction shaping, from which we trained an agent that is doing the kind of reasoning that I'm talking about. And you'll see that this trained agent actually does much better. And I'm going to show you both an unsuccessful version of that trained agent and a successful one. And what I want you to see is by the time the successful trial comes around, the agent is actually manipulating the goalkeeper in a serious way. Here you go. So you'll see that he turns a little bit that way, a little bit this way to try to confuse the goalkeeper. And eventually he's going to make enough space to be able to kick, and the goalkeeper has no chance. And so the types here were learned from people. We looked at how people do these kinds of tactics, and we acquired a number of different types, based on which we do the kind of belief update to say, you know, which type is the goalkeeper currently and what's he doing.
That would be interesting. I was just about to ask this question. So
Yeah.
Human goalkeeper.
And this is an expert human goalkeeper. So this is the student who does this research.
He's coming in front as well.
Is he only allowed that scripted motion?
He's only allowed to walk along the line. And then the
scripted sort of...
yeah, the dive is a scripted motion. Yeah.
Doesn't seem the best possible motion.
I agree.
It seems you'd be better to go up onto that white line and just keep your feet together.
I agree with that, yeah. So here the setup was to try to keep it balanced so that we could do a comparison against lots of different scenarios. So here's our learning agent actually scoring even against the person. So now you see him suddenly switch around when it's too late for the goalkeeper.
He's going to bore the goalkeeper to death.
And I'll end with one slide which to me is one of the more important ones, which is that. So we asked all the people who played against this agent. So we had a double-digit number of people who played. And we asked them these two questions. When you played as a striker, what did you think of the learning agent? And when you played as a goalkeeper, what did you think? And the interesting thing is that when they played against a learning agent, which is this case, a substantially larger number of people thought that the other robot was actually being strategically intelligent. So a lot of them thought the robot was slightly better because they couldn't win. But a substantial number here, as opposed to here, actually thought that the robot was trying to learn and look intelligent, which was quite encouraging because oftentimes when we do these kinds of experiments, precisely the kind of issues that you are asking come up, which is that we have to carefully engineer the experiment. We have to say that, you know, this robot is only allowed these motions, the striker is only allowed these kicks and so on, because that's the only way that we can actually set it up as a learning problem on which we can make progress. And so our fear is always that by the time we do all of this, regular people look at it and say, yeah, that's not interesting. So it was kind of satisfying to see that people thought, yeah, it was, you know, it was an interesting thing to play against. And our hope is that if we keep going along this for a while, then eventually, you know, one day we're going to have that kind of interaction happen.
Okay. Yep. Thanks. Ram. So we are running out of time. We maybe have time for one quick question.
Yes.
You talk about game, and that's, I guess, this brings an adversarial setting. What about collaboration?
In what sense do you mean?
I mean, in the sense that you know that you have a strategic collaboration between a set of robots which are going to collaborate.
So I would argue that, so what I call the ad hoc coordination problem, that's explicitly intended to include both of these things. So, I mean, so Thomas Schelling has this analogy of, you know, on the one side are completely adversarial games, zero sum. On the other side are just pure cooperation games. And in between are mixed motive games. So I would argue just about everything in real agents are mixed motive games, where you want to collaborate with the other person, but you have some uncertainty, such as the fact that I don't really know what are you doing currently. Maybe we are trying to move a piano, and both of us have the same objective, but I don't really know if you're going to go left or right. Yeah, so there's this notion of us still trying to figure out which type you are so that I can play the best. So when I showed you in that plot in which I said that we won the same number of games as, let's say, the alternating algorithm, but we had much higher total welfare. That was an example precisely of collaboration, in which I'm saying that I played against the person, and we did as well as the other algorithm, but we did it while actually improving the total welfare of the overall system.
Basically, just to add on that, so Yoram and I have been doing some cooperative games and experiments on cooperative games, but yeah, the learning problem is a big challenge there. Yeah, so let's thank Ram again, and he will be here for the rest of the day. So if you want to have one-on-one discussions, please let me know.
Thank you.